So welcome everyone to the next installment of the GVI Workshop Series. Today's topic is law enforcement and police legitimacy. And we have actually three great presentations for you all, but we'll just do a little bit of overview beforehand. Sure, if you've attended any of our sessions already, some of this might be familiar to you, or if you've watched our recordings, but I always just want to go over the basics about who we are and what we do. So NNSC, or the National Network for Safe Communities, is an action research center based at John Jay College of Criminal Justice here in New York City that implements proven strategic interventions to reduce violence. NNSC's mission is to reduce violence, build trust, and transform public safety in partnership with communities around the country and around the world. So this workshop series focuses on one of our interventions, one of NNSC's interventions, the group violence intervention, or GVI. But over the course of these presentations and the previous workshops, if you've seen them, we'll touch on a lot of our other work, including the intimate partner violence intervention, reconciliation and legitimacy, some of our international work. So it all kind of ties together. These workshops specifically are meant for new, interested, and returning partners to this work. So the National Network is a network of sites and cities and jurisdictions around the world, country, and these workshops are meant for folks who are new to that network and new to this work, interested in learning more or working in a site that is already doing GVI, but someone themselves are new to the work, and folks who previously worked with us and are now returning to this work to kind of teach, get people up to speed, and create a space for people to learn about the work. So these workshops are meant to be discussion spaces to talk about violence prevention, focused deterrence, GVI, and new innovations in the field of violence prevention. Each session, you'll hear from experienced NNSC staff members, some of our amazing site partners, and you'll be able to participate in roundtable conversations, ask questions later on via chat or raise your hand in the Zoom room. And the sessions are open to all who are interested in exploring the GVI approach to violence reduction in their communities. So that's community-based organizations, social service providers, law enforcement, support and outreach, municipal workers, academics, anyone interested in exploring this GVI approach is welcome to come to these workshops. So like I said, today's topic of discussion is law enforcement and police legitimacy. It's a crucial part of our work and one of those 3 feet of the three-legged stool that we've talked about in previous sessions, alongside community more voices, support and outreach, and the project manager on top. And before we get into the meat of the presentation, we're just going to go into breakout rooms for 3 or 4 minutes, have everyone say hello, where you're from, why you're joining today. Then we'll come back into the main session and start today's presentation. All right, I believe everyone is now back in the main session. So welcome back. Thank you again for joining us. And now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Talib Hudson, who's going to talk a little bit about the previous session, how it connects to today's session, and then set up the 3 great presentations we have for today. So over to you, Talib.
Great, thank you very much, Michael. So as Michael stated earlier, today's workshop is part of a larger series and going through the different elements of GVI, the group violence intervention. And we say that GVI is a 3-legged stool. It's a violence prevention strategy that relies on support and outreach, community moral voice, and strategic law enforcement. And the previous 2 sessions, we talked about support and outreach and the community moral voice. The most immediate one preceding being the community moral voice session. And in that part, we talked about what the traditional role of community moral voice has been, which had primarily been participating in the call-ins, which is part of the communication strategy. And if you're not familiar with what a call-in is, I highly recommend you check out one of the previous videos on direct communication. But traditionally, the community moral voice had played a role in the call-in and maybe sometimes in the custom notifications as well. And part of what we talked about last session is how the community moral voice, which are your community leaders who may not necessarily be support and outreach folks and are not necessarily law enforcement folks, but how they can play a more expansive role and be a more foundational partner in your overall violence prevention strategy. And we talked about the many different roles that they can play and ways to get different folks in your community involved in serving in that community moral voice role. So now that we have talked about the support and outreach and community moral voice, today we want to cover that 3rd leg around strategic law enforcement and legitimacy, because legitimacy is really a central component, a central key part of what makes this whole partnership work. And in case you're wondering, what is legitimacy? I'm not sure what that is. We're about to find out. So one of my colleagues, Danielle Davis, has done a lot of work in this area. She could not be with us physically today because she is actually overseas. But she did record a video to communicate a message to you. And then following her will be my colleague, Lori Owen, who will continue along with the presentation. So now I will go ahead and pull up Danielle's video, and everyone feel free to enjoy. Can everyone see that screen? See that, Michael? All right, and let me make sure that we are also sharing sound and optimizing for video clip. All right, here we go.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Danielle Davis, and I am a senior field advisor with the National Network for Safe Communities. I am thrilled to be able to connect with you, albeit not in person, at least over video, about this very important topic, GVI and police legitimacy. So the thing about legitimacy is that as law enforcement, you guys already know what that looks like. As researchers, our job is really to learn from a lot of different sources of information, and particularly the experts on the ground like you. And through observations of great police work, certainly over the course of our time as a research organization and dating back to a lot of other research that's been done over the past several decades with policing that we've spent a lot of time on and paid a lot of attention to, we found that police legitimacy really can best be understood by looking at four main components. And that's what we like to delve into with our conversation today, understanding those components and understanding how the operationalization of them can help reduce violence and meet all of our mutual goals of increasing public safety. So the first of those components is really looking at community members' levels of trust in police. And this is a fairly straightforward one. There's no big rocket science here. You guys, again, already know what this looks like when community members feel safe and that they can come to the police when they need help. Second main component is confidence that community members have in the ability of law enforcement to do its job effectively. So community members all depend on police to help keep them and their neighbors safe. So what this metric is looking at is, do community members actually feel that this is the case? And this one, again, shows up in a lot of different ways, particularly when it comes to gun carrying. For example, I could share some studies that have been done on gun carrying ownership rates in Chicago among youth, people who felt like they had to carry a gun because they didn't necessarily trust the police to be able to keep them safe. But as my main work here at NNSC is focused on our police community reconciliation work, I like to share one of the stories from somebody who I look up to very much and whose work I admire, retired police captain down in Birmingham, who led a number of these listening sessions in the community and was speaking with some local high schoolers who talked about the fact that they felt like they need to carry guns, and that admitted this in a room full of law enforcement, as teenagers perhaps are only so bold to do. And the captain asked them, why they felt the need to do that. They just said they didn't feel safe. And even though we know that this is something that drives a lot of the decision making from some of the most marginalized people in our community, it's always hard hearing that from children. And as a father, that hit this captain really hard. And he stood there and he said, I'm sorry. I'm sorry if it feels like you guys can't be safe at 14 years old without having to carry around a gun, then clearly there are things that we need to be doing better, and we'll commit to doing that. So with that statement and with the efforts that came from that, he was looking to do ultimately is increase those young people's confidence in the police ability to do their job and thus increase police legitimacy. Third area that we look at is whether community members approve of police actions. And this primarily comes down to a moral or ethical question, particularly around decisions of use of force. Do people feel that it was fair or justified to use a certain amount of force? And some of this can be further explained in conversations. I've worked with a lot of departments who do civilian use of force training to explain why certain decisions are made. For example, why you can't just shoot at somebody in the leg, and to help give them a little bit more insight into how policing works. And this can be beneficial in a lot of ways. But a lot of what it really comes down to is something I've heard officers say all the time. Look, you have your lawful but awful, right? And something may have been by the book, but if its ultimate impact in the community is to detract confidence and to just bring a lot of condemnation, then there's a question as to whether there's another approach that can be taken and what can be done to address that miscommunication gap and address the actions that led to community members feeling so upset, and how we can work together to co-create policing that feels good for both law enforcement and community members. And I say co-create because, as you all know, having done this, policing is something that can't just be done by you guys. And that's where we come in with our research. What we found is policing works best when law enforcement bring their expertise and their resources to the table, and community members are empowered to do the same, and together we co-create public safety. So again, going back to why we're having this conversation today and why police legitimacy is so important, that's why. So yes, it's important for community members to trust the police, to have confidence in the police ability to do their jobs, to approve of how the police operate, all coming to whether they are willing to work with the police in the interest of public safety. And that's the fourth area that a lot of researchers have pointed to as a component of police legitimacy, that willingness to, I don't just say cooperate, I say to come to the table as partners, because that can look like community members dialing 911, right? And we know this is especially difficult for survivors of domestic violence to do, and how rarely they'll call 911 as opposed to other crime victims. But this can also look like sharing information when asked to help solve a crime. This can look like showing up to public safety meetings in the community to discuss what can better be done to reduce violence. And these aren't just abstracts, these are real. I've talked with a former sergeant in East Chicago, mentioned doing runs out there and having to serve warrants for domestic violence, and having enough legitimacy in that community for people to say, no, you have the wrong address. He actually moved a few weeks ago. You can find him down there. That's what legitimacy looks like. And again, when I started out saying that you guys know what this means and what it looks like on the ground, that's what I'm talking about. These are the examples that we learn from and bring together to shape these discussions. And that's what we mean when we talk about police legitimacy. When I worked on the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice, very long name, also a long project, it was funded by the US Department of Justice. We did quite a lot of work with police legitimacy, procedural justice training, implicit bias training, and reconciliation. And the Urban Institute evaluated that work and did surveys both after implementation and beforehand. And even before implementation, in cities like Minneapolis, Pittsburgh, Stockton, Birmingham, Fort Worth, Texas, Gary, Indiana, in the most disadvantaged neighborhoods, which had the lowest levels of trust among community members for law enforcement, they found that still the majority of residents were willing to show up to talk with the police in good faith about how to improve public safety. That's significant. That shows how much further we can go when we make these concrete investments in police legitimacy. So I talked a bit about what it means and, of course, why it's important in terms of the connection with reducing violence. I mentioned the gun carrying rates. Thing about gun carrying rates, it's not just toting them around, it's using them. And you all have such a difficult job in responding to shootings and homicides, and even just on the research and having to review some of that data. I can only imagine how difficult it is being on the ground, having to deal with it and having to deal with children and the elderly who become collateral damage in these fights between groups. So it's always a very serious issue when people feel the need to resolve violence through guns. And when there are low levels of police legitimacy, as I mentioned those previous studies, we tend to find higher levels of gun carrying and higher levels of violence as well, because people will use those guns to retaliate. People use those guns to make sure that they protect themselves and their loved ones from others who may cause harm instead of reporting them to law enforcement or instead of assisting with an investigation. And all of this goes to fuel these cycles of violence. And when you have those high levels of violence, it's very difficult to have faith in the people who are supposed to be keeping you safe, right? So the more that work that we can do together as law enforcement, as community members, certainly as researchers, us trying to do our part, and as many different stakeholders in the community, when we can come together and decide that we want to invest in every practice that we can to enhance police legitimacy and work with community members, that serves all of our benefit. Now, that said, I did point out the ways in which low levels of police legitimacy connect to higher levels of violence. And there are some narratives that fuel into that. And I'm sure you all have heard this before, where community members just say, you know, cops don't want to help us, they don't care. They don't care about us. We hear that one comes up a lot. The cops don't care. They just want to oppress, etc. And then, of course, on the policing side, we also hear some of the other toxic narratives that can emerge from the same kind of frustration, right? Oh, the community, nobody cares about the violence. Nobody wants to do anything. They're all living off of the drug money, or whatever sort of narratives that we hold against each other when we don't talk about harm that has taken place in the past, harm that is going on in the present, and ultimately fueling these low levels of legitimacy and this discord between law enforcement and communities. That said, these are all things that can be addressed through best practice policing. And I've actually heard one officer say, you know, we don't just call them best practices, we try to call them current practices, because these are things that we want to make sure that we are implementing, not just hearing about at other departments or at IACP conferences every year, but that we are implementing on the ground as real-time policy and practice changes, and that we're holding each other accountable to making those changes. And by virtue of you all being in the room today and all the career decisions that you've led to this point, clearly you've been making those decisions to enhance legitimacy in your own way and together with your departments, particularly through GVI. That is huge. And with the group violence intervention, there are a number of different ways in which we can reduce harm that has occurred and enhance legitimacy. And before I get into those ways, I do want to just be straightforward when I mention harm, because I've said it a few times. What I mean by that is, of course, the history of policing, and it's not the history of every individual police officer, but it's a reality for a lot of people that police departments were, merged from neighborhood watch groups, which kind of came from a colonial model, and others from slate patrols. And that doesn't mean that that's the direction a police department wants to head in today, but history lives in us. It lives in our bodies, it lives in our memories, it lives in the experiences and stories that are passed down from our parents, grandparents, and so on. So it's important to acknowledge and address that. And we can't turn a blind eye to the fact that we have been living moments of reckoning with histories of police violence and of controversies with law enforcement acting in ways that undermine community safety, undermine duty of care, etc. And that doesn't speak for all law enforcement. I know so many people who've gone into the profession precisely because they want to drive that change. I imagine quite a few of those people are on this call today. But it's so important to at least just acknowledge what has happened and where we are, because that helps drive trust with community members as well. And we can all admit what has taken place in the past and that we want to move forward together. It makes a huge difference in terms of being able to lay a solid foundation for building trust and strengthening relationships. And that's what GVI does. GVI in so many ways allows us to enhance police legitimacy by breaking with past practices that may have been enacted in good faith, such as zero tolerance policing or broken windows, with the goal ultimately of trying to reduce crime and disorder, but unintentionally caused more harm, right? So GVI and the others, of course, we'll get into this. You all have probably heard this ad nauseum already with universities and other meetings and advising calls, is aimed to be much more of a surgical tool, right? So not just to kind of use the hammer and the mallets, but to be very, very careful about how we operate and how we move in communities, making sure that we reach out to the people who need the most help and connect with them, hot people, so to speak, as opposed to hot places, working with them, offering services, but making it very clear that the violence needs to stop. And therefore, by focusing on that risk, by focusing on the fact that many people who commit violence, especially in connection with groups, are likely to be victims themselves, we are showing such a clear and strong break with the practices of the past that may have led to those low levels of trust and low approval, etc. So this is an opportunity to work closely with community members, to work closely in a new way and meet all of our goals towards reducing violence. And I'd like to share, just before we wrap up, some quick statistics from former chief out in Stockton, California. That was one of the national initiative sites. And that chief had been leading ceasefire work in his city, as well as reconciliation, procedural justice training, and implicit bias training. And he credited that work together with seeing a 40% drop in criminal homicide from 2017 to 2018, a 31% reduction in non-fatal shootings, and their homicide clearance rate jumped by 68%. That's impressive, and I know that's something that everyone in this room wants, right? The reductions in violence, higher clearance rates, to feel more job satisfaction, going out in a community and getting nods and getting smiles, and community members feeling safe, wanting to go up, wanting to say hi, knowing that we are in this together. Together, we are all a part of the community, and law enforcement is not apart from the community, to borrow a phrase from our director, Paul. So I'll leave it there and turn it over to some of the others to keep going. Thank you so much, and I hope that this has been helpful.
All right, we thank Danielle for her contribution. And now we will kick it over. Michael, should we just go straight to Lori? All right, now I'll kick it over to my colleague, Lori Owen. Take it away, Lori.
All right, everyone, just give me 1 second here. I'm gonna turn off my camera because I look weird when I'm trying to look at my screen. Let's see. Just bear with me 1 sec. Sorry about that. I had everything right here. Okay. never as smooth as you think it's going to be when you try to do these things. So I apologize. Okay. All right, can you see my screen?
Yeah, Laura. Yes.
All right. Okay, everyone. So Danielle provided a lot of information about legitimacy, and I feel like, we all kind of understand, the basics of it, right? Like being legitimate means you're perceived by the community as doing the job that they expect you to do, right? You're doing it with fidelity. But when it comes down to actually doing it, what does that mean? Like, how does that apply to the work, like in real terms, not just philosophically, but like, how are we actually going out and doing the work in a legitimate way? And one of the things that GVI does is that, it reduces violence, and that's important, but it also enhances legitimacy. And so I want to kind of dig into that a little bit about how, focusing on GVI can really have an impact on, the level of legitimacy that you have in your community. So we know that GVI reduces violence, and we can certainly share with you the information around that, right? This information is, some of it's a little bit older, but I can tell you we have cities like Miami and Philly right now that are seeing reductions as well. Miami is knocking it out of the park right now. And so that's good news, right? We know that when we do GVI, we apply our framework with fidelity, that it works. We also know that, we can do it in a quick way, right? So when we are able to focus narrowly on the small number of people that are driving violence, we do a couple of things. We can drive down the violence quickly, but we're also subjecting a much smaller group of people to our justice system. So we're basically taking the footprint of law enforcement and we're shrinking it down so that we're focusing on the drivers of violence and not the community as a whole. And that really is important. And that's a distinction from some of the ways that we've approached violence prevention in the past. So, when we think about violence, we understand that it's not evenly distributed, right? You go into a city, there's areas that are going to be more violent than other areas. It's concentrated in poor communities of color. It's been that way for a long time. And so, we have to think about that, right? Think about the impact that police have had in those communities. Think about the impact that violence has had in those communities. And think about, what the experience is like in those communities, and how, when we are applying GVI, as a methodology to reduce violence there, are we working within the framework of GVI that allows police to do what police need to do to drive down violence, but also partnering with other agencies in a community so that it becomes that three-legged stool that Talib mentioned earlier. So the thing about violence is, we know that it's concentrated, right? We know that it's concentrated in certain communities within a city, right? But within that, we're still talking about a very small percent of the population that's represented in homicides. So, when you look at 0.6% of the population, and this is an average, right? They're represented in 50% of the homicides on average. I can tell you, we've worked in cities that it's been 85%. So when you're thinking about it in that way, 0.6% of the population, we're looking at, in a city like Nashville, where we did their problem analysis not too long ago, 500 people is what you're looking at. And when you think about that, it's not a very big number when you're thinking about, the drivers of violence, and you're thinking about this really big problem of violence. And so one of the things that GVI really does is kind of shifts thinking to making this a very small problem, or I guess a big problem with a small focus is a better way to say it. The thing about the two historical approaches is, we have this law enforcement approach that's been, kind of the zero tolerance, right? We're going to crack down on crime. We're going to be tough on people that drive violence, but we're not looking at it in terms of the dynamics of groups. We're also not thinking about it in terms of, what the impact is of that enforcement, right? So, you know, a lot of times you do sweeps and, you know, you're going to get your guns, you're probably going to get your drugs, you're going to get all kinds of things. But in the end, we're not really impacting violence. I mean, sure, maybe there's some incapacitation in the short term, but in the long term, we know that we don't address the dynamics that are actually driving violence. We're just kind of perpetuating this cycle of, you know, taking some people off and new people move in, and we're always behind it. We're not really getting out ahead of it. And that's a big thing. You know, we think about, especially now with resources being so limited in a lot of our cities, you know, we have to think about it. Do we want to apply a little bit on the front end, or, you know, kind of the ounce of prevention, or do we want to be reactive and then we're showing up at the homicides where, you know, we have to do a lot later. And so when we think about it in that way, you know, if we're preventing that violence from happening, then we are not having to answer for it later. You know, and drugs. I mean, we've always had, you know, we had the war on drugs, and I mean, nobody solved that problem either. So I think, you know, when we're thinking about the way we've been doing things, we have to think about this idea that, you know, crazy, you kind of doing that same thing over and over again and getting the same results, but still expecting something different. And so what we really want to think about is how we can, you know, look at what we're doing and make the kind of changes that we need to make to be more strategic, but also to get out ahead of violence instead of just responding to it. The other side of this has been social services. So we're gonna get everybody jobs, and we're gonna make sure that everybody's eating well, and we're gonna focus on these root causes, right? Or we're gonna just, you know, put it in the hands of social services. Police aren't gonna worry about it at all. And I mean, there's a place for it, right? People need services. However, relying on that entirely makes it kind of this, we're gonna help you if, you know, it puts these, you know, stipulations on helping and sort of, you know, determining who's actually worthy for help. And, you know, you're not focusing on violence, you're giving people things that they may need, but even that doesn't have an impact. And if you notice, the two traditional approaches don't include that community component. That's huge. If you don't have that community component, then you don't have a three-legged stool, you have a two-legged stool, and it doesn't really work. And so that's something that when you are thinking about legitimacy, you have to be a partner with your community, because that's really going to be the key to getting support and to making change. And so when we think about those communities and we think about this really small number of people driving violence, we have to take a step back and realize that some of the things that we've thought or said, you know, oh, these bad neighborhoods, this is a bad area, this is a dangerous community. But the numbers don't support that. When you're thinking about 0.6% of the population, that means most people in that community are absolutely not driving violence. But the people in that community are subjected to the effects of that violence. So that's something that we really have to think about. It's not our job to fix anybody. We're not fixing communities. We don't need to fix them to fix gun violence. You know, we have to understand that, you know, when you are living in a community with really high levels of violence, that really affects people that are living there. There's fear, there's trauma, there's a lot of really adverse experiences, and that has also led to a lot of over policing, unfortunately. So when we can take this big problem, this big neighborhood problem of violence, and we can really whittle it down into something really small and manageable, it makes it a lot easier on police to go out and do what they need to do, but it also makes it easier for the community to accept the police doing what they need to do, because they're not subjecting every single person in that area to police over and over. They're not subjecting people that are not engaging in violence to this big law enforcement footprint. You know, and one of the things that I always say, you know, a lot of times we would do these big, you know, stops, and we would, you know, take over these communities, and we would get all these guns and we pat ourselves on the back. And I would say all the time, if, you know, I grew up in a rural area, and I can tell you that if you stopped as many vehicles in my area as in the city, you would have twice as many guns, but not the violence. So I think, you know, you have to think about that, right? Like, we're focusing sometimes on the wrong things, and we're not focusing narrowly enough to have an impact. And we have to not subject everyone to the police presence. So the way we do that is by, you know, really thinking about the framework of GVI. And I know sometimes people say model, but I really like to think about this as a framework because, when you use it as a framework, you have the wiggle room to make it personal, right? If you're in the South or you're in the Midwest, your experience is going to be different than a city in the Northeast. Your customs are different, your culture is different. And so we have to think about how we can make sure we're tailoring our engagement to the communities that we're actually serving. And so this is not something that we think about as a program because programs come and go. They have start dates, they have end dates. Funding dries up, they go away. But when we can think about this as a way of doing business, a way of operating, a way of engaging, then we can institutionalize this in ways that will last for a really long time. So, the core elements are super simple. We want the community to have a moral message against violence. So part of that partnership is the community taking a stand against violence. Part of it is a genuine offer of help. And so when I say genuine, I mean not just throwing a card at someone and saying, hey, call this number if you want something, but really wrapping people up, particularly people that have been failed in the past by some of our services. And then really just being transparent about what law enforcement's doing. Hey, we're here, we're focusing on violence. If you or the people that you're hanging around with are engaging in violence, you're going to have our attention of the law enforcement partnership, not just police, but also probation, parole, prosecutors. So if you don't want to have that kind of focused attention, then we need the violence to stop. So people are getting a really clear message about what you're focusing on and what happens when they break these codes of violence within the city, but also how they can get that pressure to stop, what they need to do to not have that focus and attention. So that's really, it's pretty simple, but it really does take, a strategic approach and it takes some effort. And so when we think about, when we talk about legitimacy, we have to acknowledge that some of the things, some of the practices, some of the history has not been great. And because it's not been great, and we work all over the country with cities that have been through some pretty terrible things, those things cause harm in the community, and that harm causes levels of distrust. And so when there's low levels of legitimacy, there's higher levels of violence. That means people are more likely to say, I'm not going to rely on the police to keep me safe. I'm going to handle this myself, right? Because working with the police makes you a snitch, or they're afraid that the police are not going to actually help them. And we're subjecting people to higher risks of victimization or retaliation. So we have to really think about that. But in cities where legitimacy is higher, you're going to see more calls for service. And in cities that we've worked with, we've seen calls for service go up because people are starting to trust the police more, and they'll rely on the police to actually protect them. So, when we can center our work, everything that we're doing on being procedurally just, really being effective in what we're doing and incorporating the community, then we're going to have a much higher level of legitimacy than when, police are in a community and community does not understand what they're doing, why they're doing it, what they're focusing on. So the thing is that we have to make this conscious effort to break away from the things that we've done in the past. We have to say, we're not doing things the way we did before. It's just, it hasn't been productive and it hasn't worked. But what we want to do is think about, focusing on risk, because risk is a two-way street. People that are victims today are often perpetrators tomorrow, and vice versa. So we have to really think about that. So when we focus solely on people that we believe are driving violence, we're missing the victim side of this. We're missing the other people that are at risk. And we're also missing, what happens next when there's retaliation. We're missing those steps. So what we want to be able to do is engage with people directly, let them know what we're doing, and do it in a respectful way, not in a, a threatening way, not in a scary way, but in a way where we're just being transparent. Hey, this is what we're doing. We really want you to be safe, alive, and free. And so this is what we can do. We can help you. We can, work with you. But if violence happens, we're going to have to focus on that. And just by doing that alone and really being transparent, there are reductions in violence because people understand what's expected of them. They understand what the police are doing. it's rare that people can recall a time when they've had police come to them to have a conversation. A lot of the experiences historically have been at their worst moments. I know, I was a police officer. You're showing up at someone's lowest point, and then you're taking someone out of the house, you're bringing someone to jail. So you're taking those moments, and that's how you're memorialized to those people. So you have to really think about that. You know, when you're engaging with people, I mean, even if you have to take somebody, right? It's all how you do it. You know, can you step outside? Can I not do this in front of their family? Can we have conversations that don't involve me, you know, kind of standing over you? Just those little things and the way that you engage with people makes a huge difference. So, you know, when we're talking about kind of the strategy piece of this, it's really simple. You identify the small number of people. And so we'll talk about that a little bit, but your shooting reviews, right? How are you talking through incidents? You know, how are we taking this intel that we have, this data, and making it actionable? Because if we have garbage information going in, we're going to get garbage out. You know, it's a small number of people. So if we're not identifying the small number of people, the right people out of the gate, then everything we do after that probably isn't going to impact violence very much. So that's super important. That is probably the most important, to make sure we're focusing on the right people. And then we have to open the lines of communication, right? We have to get out and have conversations with people and do it in a way that's respectful, but also open those lines of communication so they can ask you questions as well. The community can ask questions. What are we doing here? Why are you here? What are you doing? What's different than what you were doing before? But also explain to people, hey, listen, this is a new way of doing business. We are not going to accept violence anymore. And we want everyone to be safe. So we are going to focus on the people that are at risk, and we are going to try to give them help. And that help is, you know, to keep people safe, alive, and free. That's really the crux of this, right? Our success is not measured by, you know, how many people got jobs today, or how many people, you know, went back to school. If they are safe, alive, and free, then we take the dub, because that's what we want. The thing is, though, is when we do have to impose consequences, when we do have to go out and have that law enforcement action, we want it to be a last resort, and we want to have triggers for that. So, you know, if a group is engaging in violence and they continue to shoot and kill, then they have to have that attention. But we want it to be so that people understand that there's a difference. So it's not just kind of more of the same, but it feels different to them. Like, hey, when people engage in violence, they get this, you know, they're getting this attention, they're getting consequences. But when they don't, the police aren't here to, you know, to worry about them so much. And I can't see anybody, but if you need to jump in and ask me a question, by all means, feel free to interrupt. So here's the thing. The shooting reviews are really about staying on top of violence. And I don't know how many of you are doing them or how many of you have gotten to see them. But the thing is that, you know, even when we identify people that are in groups that are violent, within those groups, most of them are not particularly violent. We have the small number of people that are sort of the impact players. They're like the ones that are most likely to be engaging in the activity, kind of the ringleaders. But the thing is that even beefs, you know, and alliances, they're so fluid. So, you know, when we think about the dynamics, we need to be able to stay on top of it, because today's dynamics may not look the same tomorrow. And so when we can have, you know, operational meetings with frontline officers to really talk through a shooting incident, what we can do is we can think about what we can take away from that to get out ahead of the next incident, right? We can think about how we're interrupting those cycles of violence. And so it's really important to involve all of your frontline people to ask the kind of questions about, you know, what happened? Why did it happen? What do we know about the victim? What do we know about, you know, the potential suspect? You know, all of those things. Was it boy-girl drama? Was it disrespect? What was happening? And then, you know, thinking about it and saying, hey, what could be happening next? You know, Talib and I are always together. Talib's my ride or die, and someone shoots him. You know, you got to start thinking, what's Lori going to be doing? We probably should get out and be chatting with her to try to get out ahead of it. So, you know, by having these kind of meetings, we take this big problem, we make it small, but we also can make actionable items. We can create deliverables. We can come up with the people that we need to be speaking with. We can think about how we want to get information out, right? We want to be able to take information and give it out to the people that are not law enforcement, right? Give it to our people that are going to go out and have conversations. Give it to our people that are going to go out and engage. That's really important. We have to have that mechanism for including the other people outside of law enforcement so that they can own some of this. So that's how we can have an impact so that it's not all on the police, right? It's not all on law enforcement to go out and fix this. We can include other people. We can help them to have the information that they need so that they can interrupt these cycles, right? We're trying to facilitate, the intervention by focusing on what they need right now, right? And so when we think about that, we talk about a hierarchy of needs. It's not just about, do I have enough food, right? Do I have a home? It's, am I safe? If we can't keep people safe, then everything else that we're doing is not going to matter. And so we need to be thinking about who are the influential people that we can mobilize? Who can we identify that are impact players? How can we deploy people that can interrupt the conflicts that are brewing? What can we use from our community in these micro areas where problems are flaring up? And really just thinking about things like lighting, cameras, whatever it takes to kind of shift the environment so that we're able to have an impact on what's happening in that community. And so this is the thing. Again, it's a big problem. Violence is a big problem. What we want to do is dial it down and make it into a much smaller focus. And so one of our colleagues always used to say, when there's an elephant in the room, don't try to eat it whole. Just eat it bite-sized pieces. And so it's kind of a weird thing to say, but it's true, right? Like when you're looking at this problem is so massive, it makes it so hard to wrap your head around it. But when you can dial it down to 5 people that I need to pay attention to today, it's a lot easier and it takes a lot less resources. So when we're doing that communication, it's really 3 things. One is calling people in, people that are on paper that we can compel to come to us. We do that. The custom notification, which is my personal favorite, is going out and talking to people, street visits, conversations on people's front porch, telling them what's going on, being able to personalize a message to them. And then lastly, community police response to victims of violence, right? Going out, police and community together when there's been a shooting incident to give a goodwill message. It shows strength in that community police relationship, but it also is a message that they're hearing from police for the first time. And that really is so important in kind of extending that olive branch to our community. In the end, we know that no matter how much we do, there's always going to be a space where we're going to have to put consequences on people. And the thing about that is what we know to be true is that it doesn't matter the severity. So we don't need to think about how we can put everybody away for 25 years. What we need to think about is what can we do to apply pressure to a group of people to change their behavior? Really small stuff, right? We can be thinking about, if Talib and I are hanging out together and I'm the trigger puller, we don't need to be thinking about how we can lock Talib up for 25 years. What we need to be thinking about is how can we make Talib uncomfortable so he's going to change his behavior? And the thing is they tell people what the trigger is going to be for enforcement, they know that if they kill someone, they shoot someone, that there's going to be a consequence, and they understand that. And so when we do that and we're consistent and we're credible in all of that, then we're limiting the times that we have to actually sanction, where we actually have to go out and arrest people, because people understand what they have to do to not have that focus. And so again, really being narrow in that, using some of our other agencies, being swift, certain, and fair. So, the idea is that we want to reach a critical mass of group members, a critical mass of people that are going to have some influence. And sometimes it can be really small things that are just interrupting their ability to do what they're doing. And we'll just change their patterns in ways that will help us to, get out ahead of the violence. And it really is relying on that informal social control. And that is just so important because, as some of our colleagues have said in the past, it's the people around you that you care about that are going to have the influence on your behavior. It's not because of the police. So you have to think about that and think about how we can use kind of this combination of influential people and a little bit of interruption of lifestyle to have that impact. But a lot of it is when we are having the conversations, it's how we're having them. You know, like everyone's mom used to say, it's not what you say, it's how you say it, right? Same thing. We have to make space for other people to be heard, create safe ways for these voices to tell people what is expected of them, offer people a way out, right? We have to tell them, listen, this is what we're doing. This is how you can make changes. And, you know, if you shoot and kill, then you have our attention. But if you're not engaging in that and you want help, it's there. And that's definitely different, but it's also a really important way to, you know, to think about the way that we're engaging in our communities. And so I think I can stop sharing. I know I went super fast. I had a lot to cover and I was trying not to hog the rest of the time. Does anybody have any questions about that? I know I put a lot at you. So before I do anything, can you just let me know if you have any questions?
Just a question of the possibility of having your slideshow sent to us or those who want it.
Absolutely. Yep. Sure can. All right. So without further ado, I am going to pass this to Anthony Brooks. So he is one of our folks from Nashville and doing some really great work. So I am going to pass it over to you.
Thank you very much, Lori. As soon as I figure out the whole share screen, oh, look at this button right there. Perfect. I know that's always fun to hear someone narrate as they're sharing their screen, but that's the world we live in now. All right, so I think you can see that, and I think you might be able to see me on the side. I've introduced in our breakout, I'm Anthony Brooks. I'm the captain over our Office of Alternative Policing Strategies. I've got all of our members there, Lieutenant Rachel Reese, Lieutenant Michael Gooch, and Jeanette Reed, just because I want to make sure everybody knows this, even though I'm the one you're hearing from, this is clearly not a one-man effort. Anyone who's working in a police department, as most of you are, know that. And you know any type of organization is not the work of one man. So I want to give a proper shout out to them. Lieutenant Rachel Reese is actually the lieutenant that is over our GVI program specifically. We've got a lot of other different things we do in our office. And Lieutenant Michael Gooch is over our Partners in Care program, and Jeanette Reed is our admin. This office actually came about in the wake of 2020. In 2020, we all know it changed police work. It led to an overhaul of the way we do business. There was a lot of public distrust in 2020 that came to the head and started boiling over in a lot of cities. It did that in Nashville. I'm sure it did it very close to where you are. And so then that started leading to less police interactions with the public, because as there was distrust, there would be police officers wanting to kind of draw back, and then the community wanting to draw back from us. So even in that year, if you were in a city where you had good community engagement, like I think we actually did in Nashville prior to that year, you still saw this gap starting to form between the public and the police department. And so that led to, you know, the change in the number of interactions was positive and negative. I just mentioned the negative form because we don't want there to be any diversity in the dividing line between the police and the public. But there were some positive things, you know, as far as not doing some things about over policing certain neighborhoods, which we'll get into that as well. But it also created an attrition and a recruitment crisis. So departments across the nation were now seeing manpower shortage. They were seeing people leave, and they were seeing it harder to get people to fill those spots when people left. And so even with some positive changes that did come about as a result in 2020 with different policies in different cities like ours, you still had a workforce that was largely trying to do their job in a brand new way. This is a lot of stuff that no one's ever seen before. If you think about, if you have young kids like I do, they're teenagers now, But when they first hit elementary school, if you ever had to help with math homework and had to deal with Common Core math, it was all the same stuff we used to do. You wanted to get to the same end goal, but it was like a completely different method. And if you're like me, it was annoying and it was hard and it was a lot of work. And so a lot of police departments are dealing with that as they start dealing with policy changes. And I bring that up because that started creating challenges with rising crime rates. And it might have even contributed to in some ways whenever we're trying to figure out the best way to handle it. So we're trying to find ways to overcome these challenges and the adaptations of the ways that police work is evolving. In 2021, or it might have been late 2020, Chief John Drake was named Chief of Police in Nashville. He actually took office in 2020 as an interim and was either named to the full-time job at the end of 2020 or at the beginning of 21. Probably should have gotten that correct since this is being recorded. We'll edit that part out later so my chief won't see it. But when he came in, he actually was wanting to change the way we did things and the focus of our department. So he established the 3 pillars of our department, of the Metro Nashville Police Department. And those 3 pillars were precision policing, community engagement, and organizational excellence. The precision policing model, there are aspects of what we do now that were always a part of what we do, because right now we're focusing on problem people, and it's a more targeted approach. We used to have a little bit more broad thing with our CompStat model, where it'd be problem areas, problem people conducting problem activities. Now we're more on the problem people, problem activities side of it. So we're not flooding an area like we once were. You know, back in those days, we had, you mentioned in some other presentations, the broken windows style of policing and different models that have come before. And, you know, all things had their pluses and minuses and that sort of thing. We would flood communities and not always have a great outcome. One thing I should mention about the 3 pillars is we have those 3 pillars and Chief Drake has them set under the umbrella of do no harm. Well, that's important with precision policing model because in the old way, which used a lot of the stuff that we do now with the problem people and problem activities, you were actually kind of flooding an area. So it actually created some unintentional harm as you were, if you were in a certain neighborhood, you were making a lot of stops on the people that weren't driving the crime and things like that. So that was a welcome change between the police department and the community. Our community engagement, it's something we had at our department a long time. Like officers were really good at being out there, but now there's a more focused effort. We have different units that are specifically designated as community engagement teams. In our Office of Alternative Policing Strategies, we actually house the Office of Community Outreach and Partnerships, where we have liaisons in different areas of the community. So we're trying to get out there and actually build those bridges a little bit more to understand what the community needs and what they want. And then organizational excellence is self-explanatory. You want top to bottom everyone to buy in and to be on board with the mission of the department. So as a part of all these new things, Chief Drake actually created our office. I was not here at the time. It was created with Inspector David Imhoff, who was my predecessor in this position. And he did that with the goal in mind to help find new ways of crime reduction in this new era of police. And so some of the things we set up, and I won't go into all of them because we're only here to talk about group violence intervention, but we do have a Partners in Care program, which is a mental health co-response program. That was sort of the flagship of our office. I spent a lot of time overseeing that prior to my promotion to Inspector Imhoff's spot. So side note, if any of you are doing co-response at your department and you have any questions about that, email me separately. And we can talk about that at a later date. We have a gun retrieval program where we are trying to think of new innovative ways to get guns out of the hands of juveniles. Again, another thing you can ask me about later. A juvenile diversion program, but then also the group violence intervention. We wanted to start with group violence intervention because of the trend we were seeing in Nashville. And I think a lot of cities were seeing this after 2020. But as you can see in that slide, that is our gunshot victims. That is homicides and non-fatal shootings. So that includes all of it right there. And you can see that our violent crime was on the rise. You had a 5-year gap or a 5-year window there from 2010 to 2014, where we're 256 average, and the 5-year average in the next 5 years was 395, which was significantly higher. But then in 2020, jumped up significantly higher to 523, and then around the rise again in 2021. So as we're doing new things in order to combat violent crime, we're going to need new strategies. And so we we'll also take a look at the homicide numbers there. They're not as dramatic You see there was a little dip in 2021, but you did definitely see a rise from in the last recent years. But we had, you know, some bad years back in 2027 or 2017. But the big numbers are the overall. So, you know, homicides can kind of just depend on where someone is shot, obviously. But we needed a way to combat that. We needed a way to combat that just to keep the community safe, because that's a lot of people being shot in our city. And also we saw a lot of police involved shootings over the past few years, higher than in recent years. So, you know, it's a way to keep officers safe as well, if we can drive those down with less interaction with violent criminals. So the group violence intervention program that John Jay College had designed and was being implemented in other cities was very attractive to us as we started conducting this research. And we needed to be able to address these rising crime rates in this era where police work is evolving, and again, manpower being a huge issue. A lot of times when I'm speaking to groups, I'll ask how many people work at a fully staffed department. I can't see all of you, and we're not raising hands, but I would guess no hands went up. That's pretty much the way it goes. So no one is in a fully staffed police department. So again, that's the need for utilizing these extra type of strategies. To put that manpower point in perspective, in 2006, when I was first came out of the academy, Nashville's population was approximately 500,000 people, and today it's approximately 750,000 people. That's a 50% increase in population over the past 17 years. When I came on, we had about 1,200 police officers sworn in the Metro Nashville Police Department, and now we have about 1,400. So only 200 extra officers for 250,000 people to patrol. We've only had a 16% increase in manpower with a 50% increase in population. So that led to us reaching out in our subsequent partnership with John Jay. And you know, we started out with a lot of meetings with them, trying to figure out if this was going to be something that would fit. We decided that it would. So then in 2021, I believe it was, in December, and I know as you start doing some math, you realize it's 2023, and this process has taken a while, and we're going to talk a little bit about why. But in 2021, Chelsea and Lori and some other folks from John Jay College came in to help with our problem analysis. And what we did with that was we took our previous 200 homicides and our 100 non-fatal shootings, and we got all the detectives together, got them in a room, and we had them present all of the information to Chelsea and Lori, and at the time Louisa was here, I think, and then was the other guy's name Alex? Lori, I'm drawing a blank. I can see you, you can nod. All right, yeah. So I'm glad I remembered those names, because I didn't have those in my presentation, and that was I was just kind of winging that. I'm not great with names. But anyway, they came in and we sat in a room for 3 days, and the detectives didn't necessarily enjoy it because they had to sit there and present a lot of information to these strangers. But what we came out with was what you're looking at there. We and Lori touched on it. I think the previous presentation also touched on this, and this is actually what you're looking at are numbers that are specific to Nashville. So you'll see that less than a quarter of the population ends up being responsible for almost half of the violent crime. You got 33% there that we are certain is group member involved, and the 15% on top of that, which is likely group member involved, for you're showing almost 49% of our violent crime is being driven by less than a quarter of the population. Lori mentioned the work they did in Nashville, and we're talking about less than 500 people. So this is good news to have. And so they produced a report for us with the ties to violent crime. And so we now know that this is going to fit with the precision policing model, with the philosophies we have in place under that pillar, under Chief Drake. So this is going to be something that we're going to want to do. So it fits in there. We know who they are, and we know that our past strategies with utilizing putting cases on people and making arrests for the crimes they committed, those are still going to happen as needed. But we have this new strategy under GVI, which is the partnership, where now that we've identified these individuals, regardless of what they've done in the past, if there's nothing currently pending, if someone is wanted for a current homicide, we wouldn't necessarily extend said olive branch. But we understand that these people that are involved in these crimes and have been in the past, we can actually offer them with our partnerships a way out. I won't go into all that because Lori talked about the frameworks. We know what the way out is. We know the partnerships that we form with our service providers, job placement, all those different things to deliver those messages. Now, we've had some challenges in implementing this model. As I mentioned, it has gone pretty slow. Some of the challenge we've had are personnel, and that's from both inside and outside the department. One of the bigger ones, we have a great relationship with our mayor's office and individuals inside there and the people that work there. Problem is they've had a lot of turnover at the mayor's office in Nashville since we started trying to plan GVI. And so there's been a lot of hands involved in it, and that has led to a lot of slow going and actually getting this off the ground. I mentioned we had our problem analysis back in 2021, which right after that happened, we were discussing having a call in within the first few months of the following year. And now we can see we're 7 months into the following year. So we're still, and a lot of that just happened to be because of, as we get some momentum, someone would move on to a new job. And if we get some momentum, then another person would move on. And we had a lot of different changes. We had changes in our office. Inspector Imhoff retired. I was able to step up into his position, but then we also had the lieutenant I was working closely with in building a lot of the framework of the GVI was promoted to another division. So we bring in other lieutenants. So those are some challenges we're going to have. And I mentioned those not to say to make excuses for why it's taken so long. I mentioned it to say, don't get discouraged if you're brand new in this work like we are, and you feel like it's taken forever and you think it's going to die. And you just when you get momentum, you're going to have personnel changes. That's just the nature of the beast in police work and in government. I just say that to encourage you, not to discourage you, and not to defend us at all, just to keep plotting, because in a minute we'll get to some successes and we feel like we're at a point to where we're actually about to hit able to take off with this. So that's one of our challenges, and that holding up progress. Another challenge that we had was buy-in from different sections of the police department. Now, everybody is for reduction of violent crime. We all know the benefits that can have on police, on the community, on our jobs, and on our ways to effectively do our jobs. But the reason it gets a little bit tough with buy-in, especially with a department as large as ours, is you got a lot of different units doing different things. And you saw the slide at the very beginning where I mentioned that it is me, it is Lieutenant Reese, it is Lieutenant Gooch, and is our admin. And that's pretty much it. That's it for our staff, which means as we're building this GVI framework in Nashville, I've got to lean on a lot of different areas of our department. So I've got to lean on our specialized investigations, and they help with a lot of our data. And I've got to lean on our homicide unit. I've got to lean on our non-lethal shooting unit. And so if those of us that are cops in the room, we know that what you're hearing when I say we got to lean in on them is we're creating extra work for them. So there's going to be a lot of things that are going to be new for them that they didn't have to do before GVI, and now they're having to do it. So we're asking a lot of these other units to help us out. And so sometimes we get a little pushback. We do have, they get a pushback on just having more meetings. We do shooting reviews now. Here in Nashville, though, we actually do a morning crime call that's every morning, every weekday morning, where for about a half hour, we talk about the shootings that happened the night before. My staff sits in on that with either, it's usually Lieutenant Reese. I'll sit in her absence, Lieutenant Gooch will sit in. And so they'll listen to all that information on shootings. And then each week, midweek, we have a weekly crime meeting where all of the department heads will division heads will get together and discuss violent crimes, discuss robberies, shootings, that different things. And a lot of the same information we discuss in the morning crime calls. So then when we design shooting reviews, we get a little bit of pushback because this is a third meeting that's going to be covering a lot of the same information. However, it's important for us to sit in there and actually be able to discuss these things under the specific framework of group violence intervention, and not just over the investigative, like we're going to go after this particular person because he committed this particular crime. We get in the shooting reviews and are able to talk about a little bit deeper, okay, who are the associates and that sort of thing, and sort of expound on it. So when we first launched those, we get a little bit of pushback from different sections of our department. The third thing is challenge we've seen is building the proper infrastructure. I've seen, as I mentioned, we've had some challenges with personnel and different turnover, both in our office and in the mayor's office. And that's led to some delay in hiring certain positions that we've needed to actually shore this up and keep everything to get it launched the way we need it to launch. Like, we're still in the process of looking for a solid program manager and case manager to help with all that. We do have a really solid guy in the mayor's office who's wearing both of those hats right now simultaneously, along with a few other hats at the mayor's office. And so he is doing a great job, but we need people in the place for him. So that's been a challenge that we've had, and we think we're pretty close to making some hires. It's going to take some weight off him and actually push us significantly forward in our efforts. Now, we have had some successes. I wanted to do the challenges first, not to bring you down, but I wanted to end on some high notes. I didn't want to just say it's all challenges. We have had some wins that we can claim. One, as I've mentioned, our partnership with the mayor's office. I cannot speak well enough about them and the work that they're doing alongside of us and trying to put together service providers and just creating this whole outreach program. They've shown an extreme willingness to work with us on a lot of different fronts, which I know, as we mentioned, some of the aftermath of 2020, not a lot of cities are willing to work with the police as closely as our mayor's office is, and we're very blessed by that. And that's been a great success. So we're able to make the most of that partnership in order to sort of get this thing off the ground. Second thing we have, and this is you might be looking at it if you're paying attention and go, well, that you had that as a negative buy-in from the sections of our police department. Well, in the beginning, it was something that we were struggling with because it was hard to get people to do things for you. But the more they learn about the program, the more they see how it can help interrupt shooting cycles. And so the detectives and the boots on the ground, if you will, that are investigating these particular crimes are seeing the usefulness in it. And now, while we don't have data yet to show that we've driven anything down, they've seen what the potential for what it can do for helping stop violent crime in Nashville. So what was once one of our challenges has now become one of our successes, as we see more and more people very interested in what we're doing here at our office with the group violence intervention. Another thing that I think we do really well, I think Lori would support this, is our intel and data analysis. Lori and the folks from John Jay were great when they came in and did the problem analysis a couple of years ago. However, and I don't think she would disagree with me if I said this, I think we did a lot of the work for them on the front end. So where then they came in, they were looking at reports that were pretty well done and thought, man, they really have it together.
Cut them off.
What's that?
I say, cut them off. No, I'm just kidding. No,
turn his mic off.
No, this goes to this is the garbage in, garbage out thing. I mean, I have to say, one of the impressive things about Nashville is their intel is top notch. Their information sharing is top notch, and it's made it a much lighter lift. I can tell you that because of it. So it is definitely worth giving them kudos for that.
And I should also mention, when I say that, I'm bragging on the department as a whole and not me. I actually don't have a whole lot of stake in that. It's a lot of people that are smarter than me that are making that happen. So we lean heavily on them, and that's something we're able to relish in as we continue moving forward with group violence intervention. And I'll show you I put a little graphic. Now, this is going to look like nothing to you, and it's vague on purpose because if I were to zoom in on that graphic, there would be names and things like that. And I don't want to share any names of victims, suspects, things like that. But if you can look, I don't know if you can see my pointer moving on your screen, but this is the type of thing that we can produce as we're looking at groups. So we have like this bright red thing would be someone that has committed a robbery. And any of these, the purple lines going out is someone that has been seen and a field interview was conducted and they were together with this individual. So you can see this individual that was involved in this robbery is connected to all of these individuals here. And I just show you that because that's the type of data and intel analysis that we can have where we can realize, okay, this was a robbery committed. Maybe we can't custom them because there's charges, but look at this network that we have where we might be able to start looking at custom notifications over here on some other individuals. And then the yellow dots means that they have a history of aggravated assault. So these are violent individuals. So it helps us to start build our network to who we're going to start spreading the message. And like I said, it's purposely vague because I don't want to get into names and I don't want to share any of that in this forum. But these are the sorts of models that our specialized investigations can build for us and help us to start pointing out who we can deliver that message to. Our shooting reviews, I think there's a lot of work for us to do on our shooting reviews, but this is where we get together. And I mentioned, discuss the shooting, discuss the group involvement. We look at the social network analysis, which is one of the charts I just showed you, and try to decide based on those violent crimes, who's going to be the best to deliver a custom notification. And we do still have a little ways to go. We're trying to figure out the best way to maximize the space in the shooting reviews. But right now, we've gotten a lot of buy-in from other units who will show up with us every week. We'll sit and talk about it. They'll actually come prepared and say, you know, this is one of our big gangs in Nashville is Gen 8. They say this is definitely Gen 8 ties, and then we can start talking about who to custom, and then we have our probation and parole involved in that, and other types of entities in our city that they can start talking about how we can find these individuals. So we're really excited about what we have going there and excited to build on it, because as I mentioned, there's still room for improvement. And then I think the last thing is our custom notifications. Now, we've heard people talk about call-ins and custom notifications. I think traditionally group violence intervention starts with a call-in, so you can deliver this message in mass with the three-legged stool. Because of some of the pitfalls we've experienced here in Nashville that I've already mentioned, have not been able to do a call-in yet, but we want to get rolling because we do have this information as far as who's driving the violence. So we've started doing custom notifications. Rachel, Lieutenant Reese, rather, would go out with Ron Johnson from the mayor's office, who is our main cohort over there. And they've been going out in the field and actually trying to deliver messages. You know, a lot of times we're knocking on doors, no answers. We've talked to some mothers that have tried to put us in contact with people. But I mentioned this as success, even though when I say that, you say, well, that doesn't sound successful. It doesn't sound like you made contact. We were able to do 2 customs that were pretty, they stand out in my mind just because we did them in jail, so they were easy to find. The people we were wanting to deliver the message to were already locked up. And as we talk about police legitimacy, that was one of the challenges that they encountered as soon as they walked in the room, because initially the people they were talking to was like, I don't want to have anything to do with the police. I don't want to talk to them. But once Ron and Lieutenant Reese were able to explain to these individuals why they were there, they're not there to interview them about a crime. They're not there to do anything about what they've done. They're in there only to offer them a way out if they choose to move in a different direction as they move on with their life, depending on whatever happens with those charges. And so in both rooms, in both of those custom notifications, it went from a very contentious relationship between the individual and the police to, by the end of it, I think one of them was in tears because they were so thankful that the police reached out with this opportunity for them, if they had thought of them. And in both situations, they were both very eager to partake in what we have to offer. Now, granted, with them being in jail now and waiting some pending charges, there's some things that we got to wait on to happen before we can actually make good on some of those. But it was very encouraging to see that even as they walked in and got initial pushback. And I share this story for that reason, because as police officers, sometimes we have a tendency, if you go up to somebody, hey man, can I talk to you for a minute? And, you know, if they're, you know, go screw yourself or whatever, then we might have a tendency, all right, cool, take care. And then back out of that situation, where a little perseverance and just getting past that initial awkwardness and that initial perception of police ended up building a little bit of a bridge there with these individuals. And hopefully that, you know, can carry on. If we hope the more and more the more of these that we do, they can spread that message to more and more people in their group. And hopefully we can start building a bigger foundation. Right now we're on a very small one, but we're hoping to broaden that out and actually start doing some good work. And then hopefully, if I'm ever asked back to speak in one of these things, I can start showing some numbers for how it has driven down our violent crime. And that is a bit of a nutshell of what we're doing here in Nashville, and some of the roadblocks that we've had, some of the successes we've had. And we're really excited about continuing to work with John Jay in order for the next step to hopefully have a call in at some point, once we get the people in place that we need in some of the positions that we've been struggling with. But if anybody has any questions, I hope I can answer them.
Well, I had a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Melissa. We got two computers in here, so we kind of echoing. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
So I was curious because I heard you say something about the program that you had to get the guns out for youth hands. So I'm assuming these are the ones that between 14 and 17. So what is this program like, or can you send more information about it?
I can give you a brief nutshell of it because it's really not hard to explain at all. Basically, all we've done is reached out to a lot of different faith-based organizations in our city and given a safe haven for parents if they find firearms in the room of one of their juvenile children, a place to turn those in. As we mentioned, there are some issues with police legitimacy. People don't always feel comfortable calling the police. If a mom finds a gun in her kid's room, she might feel uncomfortable because she might think that the police would put charges on her kid if they did that. But she knows her kid doesn't need that gun, so she can call one of these organizations. Most of them are churches in town. We do have a couple of community centers as well, and they have a receptacle that we've given. It's just a lock box where only we have the key, so they can take that gun, put it in the box, lock it up. They will call our department, and a patrol officer will go out there,
Pick it up.
collect that firearm, and just in their report, all they put in there is that this gun was collected as part of the gun retrieval program. They don't ask the pastor any names of who dropped it off or anything like that. Even if they ran this thing through NIBIN and it turned up that it was involved in a violent crime, if it's involved in a homicide, we're still not going to go back and harass them. We're going to treat it as though our homicide detectives found something in a bush and then had to work backwards from there. I mean, obviously they're going to still use the gun as evidence, and if they can get prints on it, they would go that way with it, but there won't be any interaction with them to try to ask questions, to try to track anybody down that way. Last year, I think we picked up about 60 guns. We started in March, and between March and the end of the year, we got 60 guns, which as many guns as are out there, that sounds like a small number, but that's 60 guns out of the hands of youth. So, so like I said, that's a very simple program. That's a lot of just keeping relationships up with our organizations and seeing who wants to partner with us. But that's one thing we do here.
Well, I think that's very interesting. I would love for you to meet with our chief of police and have this conversation, because we've been trying to figure out a way to do this. And I
Absolutely,
think
you'll if you'll just reach out to me. I don't have my contact information up there, but see, I'll stop sharing that. I'm gonna type my email on that real quick, if y'all will bear with me for a brief moment.
Anthony also put it in the chat as well.
Oh, did you really? Well, I'll just let that be there. Lieutenant Gooch, who I mentioned earlier, is sitting in on that. He just set that, he put that in the chat. That's a better idea. It's the importance of having good people working for you, because they'll come up with better ideas. Mine was going slow. So if you'll look in the chat, our contact information is in there. Reach out. We can talk about any of our programs there, and more than happy to have those conversations.
Thank you so much, Anthony. That was an incredible presentation, and thank you all for attending today. So you had the legitimacy presentation from Daniil to kind of get us situated in the importance of legitimacy, Lori's presentation on the role of law enforcement in GVI, and then Anthony's presentation just now on kind of what it's like to carry out that work, implement that work, the challenges you hit, the successes, and what it's like day to day. So thank you to all three presenters today. Thank you all for attending. I'll just very quickly wrap us up because I know we're over time. If you bear with me 1 second. All right. So thank you again for attending the law enforcement session. Our next session, currently scheduled for August 24th, will be about project management, which is the seat of that three-legged stool we keep talking about. So who kind of keeps everything together, keeps the work going forward, sustaining momentum. So that'll be an important and really valuable one to attend. And then other sessions we have planned upcoming this fall are managing resources and partnerships, intimate partner violence interventions, hospital-based intervention programs, and more. As always, you can reach out to me, Michael Akapura, at GVI Workshop at NNSCcommunities.org with any questions. Share it to folks who want to attend these sessions. If you have questions about certain sites that we brought up or numbers or anything like that, just let us know. And this session and all our previous sessions and all our Future sessions will be uploaded to our website, nnscommunities.org/GVI Workshop. We'll be recording the session, the slide decks, any other information that was relevant or brought up in this session. And we'll also email those materials out to everyone in attendance today. So thank you so much for attending. Thank you again to the presenters, and we look forward to seeing you in the next session. Have a great day.